So recently I came across this video from a TikTok account called No Nonsense Spirituality.
Why I'm an atheist over an agnostic. One of the things that was most damaging to my testimony when I was in theology school was actually studying what kinds of societies create what kinds of gods. If your society was dependent on trade, you would have polytheistic tolerant gods. We're talking Hindu gods, Roman gods. They don't require a lot of people, and also by being tolerant for diverse beliefs, it allows for flowing trade. If the society is a hierarchy with a strict authoritarian leader at the top, then the gods will also be that too. In fact, we only get gods who need to watch over people's morality when the society gets too big that it can't kind of self-manage.
So basically in the video, she goes on to make the case that a god or gods don't exist because it's more likely that humans create gods to match the needs that we need, or the needs and the wants and the desires that we have. So there's all kinds of issues with this video. Now, I have a friend named Tim Howard. He runs a program called Doxastic Mastery, where he teaches people how to have a rigorous, intellectually grounded worldview, where they actually understand logic and philosophy and things like this, and can come to an educated and philosophically sound worldview. I'm not sponsored by him or anything like that, but he did a write-up on this post as well. And I just want to read some of the things that he's saying here. So she commits what's called an understated evidence fallacy. So this is a fallacy that happens when someone points out a general fact about a topic that fits one hypothesis better than another, but ignores more specific details that, given the general fact, actually support the other hypothesis more. In essence, she's picking general facts that support her hypothesis when there are more specific facts that might actually speak to other hypotheses better, right? He says, for she fails to entertain the very real possibility that there are aspects of this data that theism accommodates better as its evidence. And this is where he gets into epistemology, and this is where it's really good. Epistemology is essentially the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from just merely opinion. So he says, proper epistemology has us accept hypotheses on the basis of total evidence, not bits of evidence, and she has not done her due diligence in showing how much evidence for atheism this would be, or how it would even outweigh the plurality of theistic considerations in the form of scientific arguments, philosophical arguments, religious experience arguments, historical arguments, and much more. This is a really big one that I really want you to keep in mind, and that is that so many times with these pop-level thinkers, and again, Christians are guilty of it too. I'm not saying that only skeptics do this, but people on both sides do this, where they present a view that's very pop culture, gets you riled up, makes you go, oh yeah, that makes sense, but it still doesn't have any real epistemological weight behind it, right? And what he's saying here is that proper epistemology looks at all the available evidence and compares it to the available evidence from other positions and which one is more likely, right? So then he goes on to say, furthermore, she is guilty of what philosophers call anomaly mongering. He says, it is commonplace for theories to have anomalies. Even our best scientific theories contain anomalies, and yet scientists are comfortable in taking them on without worries of being irrational. Basically, what he's saying here is that even in science, there are things that happen that seem to contradict some of our theories, and yet scientists are still able to believe the underpinning principles of science without being irrational. And then he goes on to say, in the same way, I could go so far as to say this is an anomaly on the hypothesis that we live in a theistic universe and still accept theism nonetheless. The difference here is between what philosophers call a weak anomaly versus a strong anomaly. So a weak anomaly is just that. It's a weak anomaly that doesn't necessarily threaten the overall hypothesis, whereas a strong anomaly is an anomaly that actually could threaten the hypothesis. And what she does is she poses these facts against theism as strong anomalies without actually proving that they indeed are strong anomalies. This is what philosophers call anomaly mongering, and that's what he talked about here. Then he goes on to say that there are actually at least 4 theistic hypotheses that equally accommodate the data she presents, at least, right? So one hypothesis is that instead of the causal direction being human minds to gods, right? This hypothesis states that the existence of gods supervene on human minds such that humans conceive of gods, and these gods do provide some kind of utility, right? So that instead of us just dreaming up gods, this hypothesis says that there are gods out there and their existence has subconsciously supervened on our minds, And that's where that comes from. And that also does happen to provide some sort of utility. He says this would mean that we live amongst a constellation of spiritual forces whose activity impacts human affairs. Another hypothesis is that we live in a theistic universe. It's just that humans are fallible, and we fallibly come to conclusions about the true nature of these beings, allowing our contingent circumstances to color our perceptions about them. This hypothesis also equally accommodates the data she presents, because there's no evidence to say that this hypothesis is more or less valid over the one that she presents, at least within the evidence that she presents in her video, right? And then he says, another hypothesis, we could postulate that humans throughout history have utterly failed to identify the existence of gods, not because they don't exist, but rather due to human cognitive limitations, each of us being imbued with the innate impulse to search for the divine nonetheless. And then he says, lastly, it could go with the Imago Dei hypothesis found in Christian tradition, that humans are created in the image of God rather than the reverse, and that humans are doing their best job at discovering rather than adding properties of this being, each saying something that could in principle be true about a single unified creative source of reality. So those are 4 hypotheses that equally accommodate the data she presented. And it's why you have to be so careful with videos like this. We have got to stop seeing videos like this pop up and just jump on board with it, right? And I'm trying to apply the skepticism with things that I believe as well, because you get put in this social media echo chamber where people start to say things and it gets crazier and crazier, and you're like, I don't know about that. And it's so important that we start being able to think critically about things. So then he says, in order to steelman her argument, I could frame her contention in a valid modus tollens logical structure. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And this is what that would look like. It's basically a way to visualize an argument in a logical way. So he says it would go as follows. 1, if we live in a theistic universe, then plausibly the supposition of divine beings wouldn't share utility-like similarities with humans. 2, the supposition of divine beings do share utility-like similarities with humans. C, therefore, plausibly, we do not live in a theistic universe. The success of this argument hinges on the truth of the first premise. This is where it gets really good. He says, however, notice how the expectation of what living in a theistic universe would be is something that must be assumed and attached to the content of the theistic hypothesis. In essence, what he's saying is that she's assuming that a theistic universe would be one in which the supposition of divine beings do not share utility-like similarities with humans. But the hypothesis itself doesn't logically support this, and there's nothing in the evidence that she presents to support this either. She's assuming that, theism could only look this one way, and because theism doesn't only look this one way, then therefore atheism is the logical conclusion. But there's nothing based on what she's saying here that compels any theist to take her claims seriously or believe them. And he says that here, he says, there's nothing via logic that is constraining any theist to share her assumption, right? So just super good stuff. His name is Tim Howard. He runs a program called Doxastic Mastery. Just an incredible guy. So the modus tollens framework that Tim used to summarize her or to steelman her argument is one of the 8 common rules of inference. So the 8 laws of inference typically refer to rules of inference used in propositional logic or predicate logic to derive conclusions from premises. These are foundational to reasoning in mathematics, computer science, and philosophy. So that was just one of 8 laws of inference. And I highly encourage you to look into the rest and really understand them so that you can start to view arguments from a much more critical and logical lens. There are tons of examples to the contrary of the broad generalizations that she's making in the video. So for example, she said, societies who are dependent on trade or who are dependent on agriculture will create polytheistic tolerant gods because this helps trade, according to her. However, one of the biggest societies in human history, the British Empire, were notoriously monotheistic, and they were heavily dependent on agriculture. One of the biggest societies in human history is a direct contradiction to the generalization that she's making here. She also says that you need a punitive God when your society gets bigger, because when your society is small, if you do something bad, you get punished heavily for it because you affect everyone in your small community. And that as a society grows, you need a punitive God to watch over or police your morality, because you don't have the same dynamics of a smaller society, they're able to punish that accordingly. However, again, there are plenty of examples to the contrary here. One of the big ones being Abraham in the Bible. So before Israel was even founded as a nation, when they were literally just one family, they believed in a God who was punitive. And I put that in quotations because she views it as a pejorative. But again, even according to Jewish tradition, even as early as Cain and Abel, right? They believed in a God who was punitive. And they always viewed evil as being something that doesn't just happen to one another. It is an act that's also committed against our Creator. And that is an important distinction, because if our actions don't have any sort of transcendent implication to them, then what you do, both good and bad, don't have any real meaning. Another contrary example to the whole idea of trade nations being polytheistic, there was actually a time in Egyptian history where one of the pharaohs abruptly converted the nation from polytheism to monotheism while they were still a flourishing society on the Nile, which was a major trade route. So these examples of contrary evidence kind of go against her hypothesis a little bit. Another question is, what makes a trade nation materially different from simply bartering and trading like humans have done for a long time? And what about monotheism somehow prevents the trading of goods and services? There's an assumption that she has no evidence to support. That is, monotheism would significantly harm trade enough such that these cultures would make the switch to polytheism to solve that issue. But she doesn't provide any evidence for this implication. Similarly, she doesn't explain at what exact point does the growth of a society necessitate the switch to a punitive God, and why. There's a lot of implications smuggled into what she's saying that aren't really defended. Another issue is that there's this implication that humans have wants and needs, and so they'll create gods in those images. However, but when you take a look at the Old Testament, for example, what would a society have to gain from a prophet like Jeremiah? Or what would Jeremiah have to gain? In other words, if this is really just something they're doing as a form of wish fulfillment, to match their personality, why would Jeremiah endanger his life prophesying doom on his own nation? Why would Jeremiah buy a plot of land with the only money that he had from prison, especially when that plot of land was in enemy territory and it was likely that he would never see that plot of land in his lifetime? What need could Jeremiah possibly be fulfilling there? There seems to be a much greater belief and motivation going on here than just simply wish fulfillment and meeting my own needs. As a matter of fact, all throughout the Old Testament, it seems to be that whenever Israel strays away because they move into greed and adultery and violence and all these things that satisfy human desires, God judges them for that in the Jewish tradition. You also have other things going on, especially in the biblical tradition, that are so counter to the needs of a society. For example, you have God telling them not to build chariots because the technology is too strong and they can cause too much destruction with chariots. But if you were in Israelite culture and you were surrounded at all times by these militaristic, violent nations who could take you over any time, wouldn't you want to progress military technology as far as it could go to achieve military domination? I think there are certain traditions that fit with this hypothesis better, but interestingly enough, a lot of what we see in the Old Testament especially runs very counter to what everyone else at the time was doing. For example, God prohibited them from wartime rape and from depicting images of war and things like this in the temple. Whereas other cultures, wartime rape and displaying victory in the temple and things like this, these were divinely sanctioned actions. And so you have this one nation who is acting weirdly countercultural to everything else that's going on. So these are just some live questions that you should be asking whenever you see something like this. And whenever you just think critically about what they're saying and think about the implications underneath and the unanswered questions underneath. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something today. And yeah, definitely just beware of any of that pop level pseudo-spiritual stuff on any side of the equation, because there's just no real intellectual rigor behind it. So anyway, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Peace.